At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about Hermann Hoth. No dramatic speeches, no larger-than-life presence, no flair that drew attention in a room full of officers. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, spoke quietly, and carried himself like a scholar rather than a battlefield commander. And yet, by the time the Second World War reached its peak, his name was circulating through Soviet command posts with a very different tone, one of urgency, even alarm. This was not a man who inspired fear through personality. He inspired it through results. Hoth had not been born into fame or political influence. Like many German officers of his generation, he came from the disciplined traditions of the old imperial army. He served in the First World War, where he learned the brutal reality of modern combat, static trenches, massive casualties, and the painful lesson that outdated tactics could destroy entire armies. When the war ended, Germany was left humiliated, its military restricted, its future uncertain. But Hoth remained. In the years that followed, inside the small and tightly controlled Reichswehr, he quietly built a reputation, not as a visionary in public, but as a thinker, a man who studied war like a science. While others focused on tradition, Hoth was paying attention to change, mobility, coordination, speed. He understood something many still resisted. The next war would not be fought like the last. By the time the Wehrmacht began to expand under Adolf Hitler, Hoth was ready. He was not a political general. He did not rise through loyalty to ideology. He rose because he was effective, precise, reliable, and increasingly dangerous. What set Hoth apart was not just his understanding of armored warfare, it was how he used it. Tanks, to many commanders at the time, were still seen as support tools meant to assist infantry. Hoth saw something else entirely. He saw speed as a weapon. He saw confusion as a strategy. He saw that if you could move faster than your enemy could think, you could collapse entire fronts before they even realized what was happening. During the early campaigns of the war, this approach became terrifyingly real. As German forces pushed through Poland and later into Western Europe, Hoth's units did not simply advance, they surged. His armored formations cut deep into enemy territory, bypassing strong points, disrupting communication, isolating entire armies. It was not just about winning battles, it was about making resistance impossible. There are accounts from opposing forces describing the same pattern. Reports arriving too late, orders becoming irrelevant within hours, entire defensive lines rendered useless because Hoth had already moved beyond them. It felt less like facing an army and more like chasing a shadow that was always one step ahead. But it was on the Eastern Front, against the Soviet Union, that Hoth's reputation reached another level. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the scale of the conflict changed everything. This was not a campaign, it was a war of annihilation across vast distances. And yet, even here, where geography itself seemed to resist speed, Hoth adapted. His armored units moved with an aggression that surprised even his own command. They exploited gaps the moment they appeared. They maintained momentum where others would pause. And perhaps most importantly, they operated with a clarity of purpose that cut through the chaos of war. Soviet intelligence began to notice. Intercepted reports, reconnaissance summaries, battlefield analyses. Again and again, one name appeared. Not always in bold, not always at the top, but consistently, predictably, dangerously. Hoth. To Soviet commanders, this was not just another German general, this was a pattern. When Hoth was present, breakthroughs happened. When Hoth was involved, defensive lines collapsed faster than expected. Units that thought they had time suddenly found themselves encircled. And so, warnings began to spread. If Hoth is on the opposite sector, reinforce immediately. If Hoth is advancing, expect rapid penetration. If Hoth is identified, prepare for encirclement. This was not fear born from myth, it was fear built from experience. And yet, despite all of this,
Hoth remained the same man he had always been, quiet, controlled, almost invisible compared to the more flamboyant figures around him. He did not chase recognition, he did not build a public image, he simply did his job, with a level of efficiency that made him one of the most dangerous commanders of the war. But there was something else about Hoth that made him even more unusual. He did not just outthink his enemies, he was also willing to challenge his own side. While many officers adapted themselves to the will of Hitler, Hoth did the opposite. He analyzed, he questioned, and when necessary, he disagreed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but directly. Because Hoth understood something that few dared to admit out loud. Speed could win battles, but bad decisions at the top could lose entire wars. And as the conflict deepened, that realization would place him on a collision course with the most powerful man in Germany.
At first, the relationship between Hermann Hoth and Adolf Hitler seemed functional, almost typical for a high-ranking commander and a head of state in wartime. Orders were given, operations were executed, victories were achieved. But beneath the surface, something was already beginning to fracture. Because Hoth was not the kind of officer who simply obeyed. He listened, he analyzed, and when something didn't make sense, he said so. In the early stages of the war, this wasn't seen as a problem. Germany was winning. Fast, decisive victories in Poland and Western Europe created an atmosphere where confidence was high and dissent could still be tolerated, especially from commanders who delivered results. Hoth was one of those commanders. His armored units moved with precision, his operations succeeded, and for a time that success gave him a certain level of freedom. But as the war expanded eastward, the stakes changed, and so did Hitler. Unlike many generals, Hoth approached warfare as a constantly evolving situation. Plans were not sacred, they were tools. If conditions changed, the plan had to change with them. Flexibility was strength. Adaptation was survival. Hitler saw things differently. To him, orders were absolute. Positions were to be held no matter the cost. Retreat was weakness. Adjustment was doubt. And doubt, in his mind, was something that could not be allowed to spread. This fundamental difference created tension that grew with every campaign. Hoth would assess the battlefield, identify risks, and recommend changes, sometimes withdrawals, sometimes redirections, always based on what he believed would preserve his forces and maintain momentum. And often he was right. His understanding of mobile warfare gave him a clearer picture of what was actually happening on the ground than the rigid directives coming from above. But being right did not always matter. There were moments when Hoth pushed back directly, not emotionally, not politically, just with cold professional clarity. He would present the situation, explain the consequences, and offer an alternative. It was the kind of behavior expected in a professional military, under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Hitler increasingly surrounded himself with officers who agreed with him, or at least officers who did not openly disagree. In that environment, a commander like Hoth stood out, not because he was rebellious, but because he was independent. And independence to Hitler looked dangerously close to disloyalty. Still, Hoth continued, because on the battlefield, reality had a way of overriding ideology. When units were at risk of encirclement, when supply lines stretched too thin, when opportunities appeared that could change the course of an operation, he acted, or at least tried to. There were times when his instincts led to success, rapid maneuvers that avoided disaster, bold advances that caught the enemy off guard. His ability to read the battlefield remained one of Germany's greatest advantages. But there were also times when his hands were tied. Orders would come down that made little tactical sense. Hold this position. Do not withdraw. Advance here, even if the conditions weren't right. And in those moments,
Hoth faced a choice that defined many German commanders during the war: follow orders exactly or risk everything by deviating. Hoth chose carefully. He was not reckless. He understood the consequences of open defiance, but he also understood the cost of blind obedience. So he walked a narrow line, pushing where he could, adapting where possible, arguing when necessary. And each time he did, the distance between him and Hitler grew a little wider. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense that defined their relationship. Hitler did not fear Hoth as an enemy. He feared what Hoth represented: a professional soldier whose decisions were based on logic rather than ideology, a man who could see flaws in the grand strategy, a man who, in another system, might have had the authority to act on them. But in Nazi Germany, authority flowed in one direction. And as the war became more complex, more chaotic, and more desperate, that strict structure began to turn strength into weakness. Hoth could win battles, but he could not change the decisions being made above him. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, that began to matter more than anything happening on the front lines. When Operation Barbarossa began, it was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and a front that stretched for hundreds of miles. It was supposed to be a quick campaign, a decisive blow that would collapse the Soviet Union in a matter of months. At the center of that massive offensive was Hermann Hoth. For Hoth, this was the ultimate test of everything he believed about modern warfare: speed, coordination, relentless pressure. Concepts that had worked in smaller campaigns now had to function across vast, unforgiving terrain. And in the opening phases, they did. His armored units moved with stunning efficiency. They didn't just attack, they penetrated. Soviet defensive lines, often rigid and slow to react, were broken apart before they could fully organize. Entire formations found themselves surrounded, cut off from supplies, communication severed. What had once been a solid front became a series of isolated pockets. To the soldiers on the ground, it felt overwhelming. To Soviet commanders, it felt like something worse, unpredictable. Hoth had a way of identifying weak points and exploiting them immediately. There was no hesitation, no wasted time consolidating positions unless it was absolutely necessary. Momentum was everything. The longer his forces kept moving, the more pressure they applied, the harder it became for the enemy to recover. And for a while, it worked almost perfectly. Cities fell, armies collapsed, maps changed faster than reports could keep up. German forces pushed deeper and deeper into Soviet territory, and Hoth was often at the spearhead of that advance. His name began appearing more frequently in intelligence briefings, not as a footnote, but as a warning, because wherever Hoth appeared, something followed: breakthrough, encirclement, collapse. Soviet intelligence officers started connecting the pattern. When a sector suddenly became unstable, when units reported fast-moving armored columns appearing where they weren't expected, there was a strong chance Hoth was involved. And that realization changed how they responded. Reinforcements were redirected, defensive lines were adjusted, commanders were warned to expect rapid developments, to prepare for sudden shifts in the battlefield. Hoth wasn't just another general anymore. He was a variable that had to be accounted for. But the deeper the German army pushed into the Soviet Union, the more the situation began to change. Distance became an enemy. Supply lines stretched thin across endless roads that turned to mud in the rain and ice in the winter. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, everything had to travel farther, and every mile added risk. The same speed that had made Hoth so effective now created new vulnerabilities, and the Soviets began to adapt. Their early mistakes, rigid defenses, slow reactions, gave way to something more flexible. They learned to trade space for time, to absorb the Udar instead of trying to stop it outright, to counterattack when German units overextended. For the first time, Hoth was facing an enemy that was learning from him. Battles became harder, advances slowed. What had once been rapid breakthroughs turned into grinding engagements. The clarity of the early campaign faded into a more chaotic, uncertain reality. And yet, even in these conditions, Hoth continued to stand out. He adjusted where others struggled. He maintained cohesion in situations where units could easily fall apart. His ability to read the battlefield, to anticipate movement, to recognize opportunity, remained one of his greatest strengths. But there was a growing problem that even he couldn't solve. The war itself was changing faster than the strategy guiding it. German high command still believed in decisive victories, in the idea that one more push could break the Soviet Union completely. But on the ground, commanders like Hoth were beginning to see a different picture, a war that was becoming longer, more exhausting, more unpredictable, a war where speed alone was no longer enough. Still, orders continued to demand movement, advances, pressure, no step back, and so Hoth kept moving forward, because that was what he did best. But with every mile deeper into the Soviet Union, the risks grew. The front stretched thinner, the margin for error disappeared. And somewhere ahead, beyond the shifting lines and endless terrain, a city waited. A city that would test not just Hoth's skill, but the limits of everything he believed about war. Stalingrad.
By the winter of 1942, the war in the East had reached a breaking point. The city of Battle of Stalingrad had turned into a nightmare, street-by-street fighting, shattered buildings, freezing temperatures, and an enemy that refused to collapse. What had once been a symbol of German momentum was now a trap. Inside that trap were nearly 300,000 German soldiers of the Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus. Surrounded, cut off, running out of food, fuel, and ammunition. Every day, their situation grew worse. And far to the southwest, one man was given a task that many believed was impossible. Hermann Hoth was ordered to lead a relief operation to break through Soviet lines and reach the encircled forces at Stalingrad. It was a desperate gamble. The distances were vast, the weather was brutal, and the Soviet defenses were tightening with every passing day. But if anyone could do it, it was Hoth. He moved fast. Launching what became known as Operation Winter Storm, Hoth drove his armored forces forward with the same principles that had defined his entire career: speed, precision, and relentless pressure. His units pushed through Soviet positions, exploiting weaknesses, forcing openings where none seemed to exist. At first, the advance shocked the Soviets. German armored columns began to cut through defensive lines, creating the kind of instability Hoth was known for. Reports came in of breakthroughs, of rapid movement, of a force that seemed to be gaining momentum despite the conditions. For a moment, it looked like history might repeat itself, that Hoth would once again outmaneuver his enemy. And he kept getting closer. Miles fell away. The distance between his spearhead and the trapped Sixth Army began to shrink. 50 miles, 40, 30. 30 miles. Close enough that, in theory, a coordinated breakout from inside the encirclement could have linked up with Hoth's advancing forces. Close enough that hundreds of thousands of soldiers might have escaped. But there was a problem. Inside Stalingrad, Paulus was not moving. Not because he didn't understand the situation, not because he lacked the ability, but because he had orders, direct orders from Adolf Hitler. Hold your position. Do not break out. Hitler believed the Sixth Army could be supplied by air. He believed the line could be held.
He believed that retreat or even a breakout was unnecessary, and more importantly, he refused to allow it. For Hoth, this changed everything. His entire operation depended on coordination. He could break through from the outside, but without movement from within, the gap could not be closed. The longer the Sixth Army stayed in place, the more time the Soviets had to respond. And they did. Soviet forces began shifting reserves, reinforcing the threatened sectors, tightening the ring. The initial shock of Hoth's advance faded, replaced by organized resistance. Every mile forward became harder. Every gain came at a higher cost. Hoth faced a brutal reality. He could see the objective. He knew what needed to happen. He was close enough to change the outcome of the entire battle, but he did not have the authority to finish it. There are moments in war where decisions carry enormous weight. This was one of them. A single order, a permission to break out, might have altered everything. It might have saved the Sixth Army. It might have preserved one of Germany's most powerful formations. But that order never came. And without it, Hoth's advance began to stall. Fuel ran low. Losses increased. Soviet resistance hardened. What had started as a bold, aggressive push slowly turned into a fight for survival. The window of opportunity, small to begin with, was closing. Eventually, the decision was made to halt the operation. Hoth was forced to pull back. The relief attempt had come closer than many thought possible, 30 miles. That was the distance between failure and one of the most dramatic rescues of the war. 30 miles, and an order that was never given. Inside Stalingrad, the Sixth Army's fate was sealed. Cut off, exhausted, and with no path of escape, its collapse was inevitable. For Hoth, it was something worse than defeat. It was watching a victory slip away, not because the enemy was stronger, but because the final move had been denied. And in that moment, the limits of his brilliance became painfully clear. He could outmaneuver armies, he could break through defenses, but he could not overcome the decisions made above him.
After the failure to relieve the forces trapped in Battle of Stalingrad, the war on the Eastern Front changed in a way that could not be reversed. What had once been a campaign of rapid advances and decisive victories became a slow, grinding retreat. And for Hermann Hoth, it marked the beginning of the end. Not of his career immediately, but of the kind of war he knew how to win. The destruction of the Sixth Army sent shockwaves through the German military. Nearly 300,000 soldiers lost, an entire formation erased. But beyond the numbers, something else had been broken. Confidence. The belief that bold maneuver and aggressive tactics could always overcome the enemy. Hoth understood this shift immediately. He had seen how close they had come. He had seen the opportunity slip away, and more importantly, he understood why. It wasn't a failure of execution. It wasn't a lack of skill on the battlefield. It was a failure of decision-making at the highest level. Still, the war did not stop. Hoth continued to command armored forces in the months that followed, including during the massive German offensive at Battle of Kursk. It would become the largest tank battle in history, a final attempt to regain the initiative in the East. Once again, Hoth did what he had always done. He analyzed the terrain, coordinated his forces, and pushed forward with precision. His units achieved some of the deepest penetrations of the German offensive, demonstrating that even after Stalingrad, his understanding of armored warfare remained as sharp as ever. But the conditions were no longer the same. The Soviets were ready. Their defenses were layered, reinforced, and informed by everything they had learned over the past 2 years. Minefields, anti-tank guns, reserves positioned for counterattack. It was no longer a question of reacting to German movement. It was about anticipating it.
For the first time, the kind of rapid breakthroughs that had defined Hoth's success were consistently being stopped, not because he had lost his skill, but because the environment had changed beyond his control. After Kursk, the strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. German forces were pushed back, step by step, across the vast distances they had once conquered. The war became defensive, reactive, a situation that limited everything Hoth did best. And above him, nothing improved. Adolf Hitler continued to issue rigid orders, hold positions, launch counterattacks, refuse withdrawals. The same patterns that had contributed to disaster at Stalingrad repeated themselves again and again. For a commander like Hoth, this was more than frustrating, it was suffocating. He could see the reality on the ground. He could anticipate outcomes before they happened, but his ability to act on that knowledge was constantly restricted. The gap between what was possible and what was allowed grew wider with every passing month. Eventually, even his effectiveness could not protect him. As setbacks mounted, blame moved downward. Commanders were replaced, reassigned, or dismissed. Hoth, despite his record, was not immune. By 1944, he was removed from command, another experienced general sidelined in a war that was slipping out of control. When the conflict finally ended, the story did not close quietly. Like many senior German officers, Hoth was held accountable for his role in the war. He was tried and convicted for war crimes connected to the actions of forces under his command during the campaign in the Soviet Union. It was a reminder that tactical brilliance on the battlefield did not exist in isolation from the larger reality of the war itself. And so his legacy became complicated. On one hand, he was undeniably one of the most capable armored commanders of the Second World War, a man who understood speed, maneuver, and operational warfare at a level few could match, a general whose presence alone could alter the expectations of an entire front. On the other hand, he was part of a system that brought immense destruction, and he could not escape that. But perhaps the most striking part of his story is this. Hoth was a commander who repeatedly proved he could win battles. He saw opportunities others missed. He understood risks others ignored. And at critical moments, like the winter of 1942, he came within reach of changing history. And yet, he never had the power to decide the outcome. Because in the end, his greatest limitation was not the enemy in front of him. It was the leadership above him. A general who could outthink armies, but could not overrule a single man.